Hello, my name is Alan Young and I have been involved in the teaching of mathematics for over 40 years, 31 of those as a teacher myself and the remainder as a writer of maths educational software. During this time I've taken a great interest in the effects of the continued use of imperial units in the UK on our children's mathematical, scientific and technical education, and I've become convinced that this is the main reason that our youngsters do not do as well as children in other comparable countries. Now, before I get into the detail, I need to explain that this video is over 20 minutes long. I know in today's world we expect people to be able to put forward their argument in a quick soundbite of a minute or two perhaps. But I have found that the issues that I'm raising today are not understood by most people, and they dismiss the metric argument with a quick soundbite of their own, perhaps, oh, it's a European issue, or imperial units were good enough for my parents, they're good enough for me. This diagram illustrates the problem very well. The top half shows how youngsters in the UK have so many obstacles placed in their way due to the use of imperial units, or medieval units as I call them, and the bottom half shows how children in other countries have a much easier path to their learning. I have grandchildren now, and I worry that they are going to suffer the way the previous two generations of children have been handicapped in their education. Many people I speak to feel the same way. So if you are a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, or are in some other way connected with children's education, I would say that you need to worry about their future, because in this country we are very short of people skilled in mathematics, science and technology. And the only way we're going to improve this situation for them and for the country at large is to remove many of the obstacles that only youngsters in the UK have to face. If you find what I'm saying interesting and would like a printed copy of the arguments, I have written this document, How Big is an Acre? No One Knows, which you may order through the Dr. Metric website. You may find this useful, for example, for parents at your school, your children's school, friends and so on. So let's begin with a very quick rundown of how we got ourselves into this mess in the first place. Hundreds of years ago, in a time we call the medieval period, most people earned their living through farming. They reared and milked cows, chopped wood, grew corn, produced wine from grapes, fished and had a large number of skills to get them through everyday medieval life. They worked hard to survive, and let's be honest, if it weren't for their efforts, we wouldn't be here today. They designed a set of units that were appropriate to their lives. The furlong was designed as 220 yards, the distance a large horse or ox could pull a plough before it needed a rest. The chain was 1/10 of that at 22 yards, and the acre was the area of a rectangle 1 furlong long and 1 chain wide. This was the average area a man and an ox could plough in a day. The foot came from the definition of a rod, which was the total length of the feet of the first 16 men to come out of a church on a particular day. This was then divided into 16 to get the foot as we know it today. Most other units had similar definitions, but some go back even further into history. One definition of a mile, for instance, was the distance a Roman soldier could walk with 2,000 steps. We managed to keep using many of these units well into the 1960s, but then it was decided enough was enough. People eventually realised that we needed a system of units that related to today's world, and in the early 1970s Britain made some effort to switch to the metric system, a set of units that were already being used in most parts of the world. Only enough was not quite enough. Although building regulations, engineering, science, sales of fabric, timber, etc. changed to metric, many people were reluctant to let go of those precious medieval units. And here we are, over 40 years later, almost 2 generations, still using 2 sets of units. And many people ask, what's wrong with that? And in this movie I intend to illustrate the problems this is causing for the education of our children. But first, let me point out that the use of medieval units is far more widespread than is generally believed. Most people think we only use them for our heights and weights, but their use is far more extensive. We use them for baby weights, clothes sizes, road signs involving speed, distance or height, TV and computer monitor screens and their resolutions in dots per inch, room sizes in estate agents' details. We sell draft cider and beer in pints. We use degrees Fahrenheit when the temperature gets very warm. We use pounds per square inch for tyre and pressure cooker pressures, ounces and fluid ounces in cooking recipes, furlongs in horse racing, miles per gallon for fuel efficiency, yards for golf distances, and the list goes on and on and on. Well, there we are, the world's quickest lesson on the history of measurement. When you look at these two slides, you can really appreciate the difference between the old order and the new world in which we live. So now let's have a look at the issues and the problems that this situation is causing for our children right here in the UK today. The first is that most children do not realise we actually live in a metric world. Almost everything around us is designed and manufactured in metric units, but most children never see these measurements. Take this car as an example. To manufacture a car takes about 10,000 measurements, every one of them in metric units. But what do our children see when they get into a car? Miles on the odometer and miles per hour on the speedometer. And the crazy thing is that even the digits on these scales are designed and produced in metric units. It's the same with road signs. Everything from digging the ore out of the ground to manufacturing and putting the sign by the side of the road is undertaken in metric units. And at the last moment, yes, you've guessed it, we slap a great big medieval unit on it. But again, these digits are designed in metric units. It's all mad, 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 I'm sure you'll agree. And here's my favourite photograph taken at the back of Shoreham Airport. And have you ever realised that in this country most people can't measure a kilometre, even though Ordnance Survey maps have been metric for decades? In almost every other country in the world, families can measure a distance on a map and then get in the car and drive that distance, so that children can see the relationship between the distance on the map on the one hand and the actual terrain on the other. Our families can't do that. One thing I should mention, by the way, is that when I say every other country in the world, I'm not including the USA, which seems to have a much bigger problem than we have. I'm simply referring to the nearly 7 billion other people in the world who use exclusively metric units every day of the week. Now, the second issue affecting our children is what I call the Great Mismatch. Let's take a look at this conversation. The son says, "Dad, we measured our heights at school today. I'm 108 centimetres. How tall are you?" And the father replies, "I'm 5'10", son." Well, the child is totally confused, of course. And the mother, "Carol, did you know Mrs. Brown had her baby yesterday? It weighed 7 pounds 6 ounces. And the girl, of course, "Mum, I don't know what you're talking about." You can clearly see what's happening here. The children are being taught metric units at school, but the parents and other adults still cling to the old medieval units that not many of them understand, by the way. This means that children become even more confused and think the mathematics they're learning at school isn't relevant in the outside world, when we actually live in a metric environment. When I was a boy growing up in the 1950s and 60s, we of course learnt the medieval units at school. But when we went out into the real world, we could see their relevance because they were being used there too. When my mother said she'd ordered 500 weight of coal, I knew that meant a quarter of a tonne. And more people did baking at home than they do today, so it was possible to buy a 1 stone bag of flour. Why, you could even go to Woolworths and buy a pound of broken biscuits. However, the situation has completely changed since then, but the continued use of medieval units makes it very difficult for youngsters to see the relevance of what they're learning at school, let alone have any meaningful conversation about their heights and their weights with their parents or carers. The next issue concerns the SAT test. Let's have a look at 2 typical SAT questions. First of all, Mick and Jenny each have a cat. Mick's cat weighs 2.5 kilograms. Jenny's cat weighs 2.2 kilograms. How many more grams does Mick's cat weigh than Jenny's? Although our children learn about kilograms and grams at school, outside they're bombarded with stones and pounds and ounces, so they don't get an opportunity to practice the metric units that they're going to be tested on in their mathematical examinations. Children in all the other countries in the world use these units all the time, and converting from kilos to grams is just part of their everyday life. This means that they're going to find this type of question much easier than our children. Now, here's a second example. Reza has a bucket that holds 8 litres. He has a glass that holds 500 millilitres. How many glasses of water does Reza need to fill the empty bucket? In this country, we still hear people talking about gallons and pints all the time. So when our children get a question like this, they're not used to changing litres to millilitres and vice versa. So again, children in other countries find a question like this much easier than British children. Well, I know what you're thinking. What's a premature baby got to do with metrication? Well, the answer is just about everything. A friend of mine is a nurse in a hospital ward for premature babies, and she reminded me that these babies, and many other young children come to that, only need very small amounts of medication. A typical amount might be just 1.5 millilitres. Imagine what would happen if a medic who was perhaps not too familiar with metric units gave 15 millilitres by mistake. That's 10 times the appropriate dose. Now, I fully appreciate, of course, that medical staff are well trained in the administering of drugs, and we are lucky to have some of the most qualified staff in the world in this country. However, it's easy to see that someone who's not so familiar with metric units is more likely to give the wrong dose, especially when they're tired, than someone who is used to using them every day. Now, the next issue is the one concerning our number system, and this is arguably the most important one of all. Our number system is one of the world's greatest inventions, and without it we would probably be living in the medieval times ourselves right now. To take just one example, there would be no national grid supplying electricity to our homes, offices, schools, factories and so on. Just imagine for a moment what that would be like. Our number system is magic. With just the digits from 0 to 9, we can represent any number we wish, whether it be a whole number, a negative number, a fraction or a decimal. And we can manipulate these numbers to do any calculation we want. But that's the thing, isn't it? Children need to learn how it works and to practice it as much as they possibly can. A moment's thought and you'll soon see that the metric system is the number system with bells and whistles, the bells and whistles being the units we use, of course. Every calculation you can do in the number system can relate to a problem in real life, at least up to GCSE level. For example, the sum 9.85 multiplied by 5.60 could be the cost of 9.85 metres of material at £5.60 per metre. The sum 6.70 times 4.56 times 0.075 could be the amount of concrete needed for a garage base with those dimensions in metres. Another very important idea that children must understand is the concept of left shifting and right shifting digits, which we do when we multiply and divide by 10, 100, 1000, etc. For example, multiplying 3.45 by 100 is simply a matter of shifting the digits 2 places to the left to give 345. Dividing 67,940 by 1000 is simply a matter of shifting the digits 3 places to the right, giving 67.940. These skills are practiced every time we change metres to centimetres or change grams to kilograms, for example, using the metric system. Now, all the while we are faffing around with stones and pounds and ounces and feet and inches, etc., our children are missing important opportunities to practice these skills. Skills that children in every other country of the world practice on a day-to-day basis and are therefore much better set to pass their mathematics, science and technology examinations. Now, please take a look at this if you would. Imagine you're a child trying to do your best at maths and you decide to weigh yourself. You come across this set of weighing scales. How long would it take you to decide which scale to read? Now look at a weighing scale from another country and compare the two. You can see how much easier it is to read. This is another major hurdle that British children have to deal with, while our children are struggling to read our dual scales, and let's face it, most give up at this point. Children in other countries have read the scale and taken the reading. And it's not just body weighing scales, it happens in many situations. Here, for example, are kitchen scales. And here are temperature scales. Notice also that with the foreign thermometers, the positive temperatures can be displayed on one side of the centre line and the minus temperatures on the other, thus drawing attention to temperatures above freezing and below freezing. This is impossible to do when there are two scales, one Celsius and one Fahrenheit, on the same thermometer. And again, our children miss out compared with those elsewhere in the world. And here's an interesting thing, pull-out tapes with just metric scales can be bought in the UK, but they're very difficult to track down. Almost all of them have metric and medieval scales side by side. But notice that the medieval units are on the top of the tape, and the scale that most people want to use, that is children, plumbers, carpenters, bricklayers, etc., is on the bottom. So every time a measurement is taken, the tape has to be used cack-handed. And another important point is that measuring scales are also number lines, so where the scale is easy to read, it's possible for parents to show their children how to calculate the difference between two weights using these number lines. Not something you see British families doing very often. And having digital scales in the family doesn't seem to help very much either, since in my experience most families keep them set to stones and pounds, and young people never get to see their body weights in kilograms. Now, when you think about the struggle that science and technology teachers have in this country, it's very easy to see that they must be tearing their hair out. They spend a great deal of their time teaching youngsters the correct metric units in their subjects and how to manipulate them. They also encourage them to watch these wonderful television programs we have these days relating to science and technology. Unfortunately, these programs almost invariably slip up by mixing and matching medieval and metric units together in the same report and often in the same sentence. You'll often see any number of these units mixed up so much that many youngsters don't even know which are the metric units and which are the medieval ones. During the floods of January and February 2014, I heard one reporter say there were millions of gallons of water covering thousands of acres of land. And I thought to myself that about 95% of the population had no idea what that sentence meant. In fact, I doubt if the reporter did either. In just about every other country in the world, all the units given in these scientific programs are in metric, thus reinforcing what the youngsters' teachers are teaching them at school, not undermining them as they are here. Is it any wonder then that many of our children do not achieve the same level as their counterparts in other developed countries? And now here's something that's only dawned on me recently. Some people will ask, what's all the fuss about? You only need to go into a supermarket and you'll find thousands of items marked up in metric units. Plenty for the children to see and handle. Well, that's true in principle, of course, but have you ever tried finding those units? For some reason, metric units are nearly always printed in very small fonts, like these on an orange juice carton and a salad cream bottle. In many cases, they're so small you have to go hunting for them, as though we're ashamed of them in some way. Compare that with the way we show the medieval units. Normally these are displayed on huge notices for all to see, and that's from the sale of land and offices to road signs, etc. It even extends to the sale of Christmas trees. So our children see mainly medieval units that they do not understand, and they very rarely see the metric units that they're going to be examined on and that they're going to need in their later life and employment. You have to admit, it's all quite crazy. And so finally, that begs the question, what can we do about all this? Well, there are a number of things you can do as an individual. Firstly, you can go completely metric yourself and refuse to have anything more to do with those nasty medieval units. You can tell your friends about this campaign and like the Facebook page and the videos. You can sign the e-petition on the government's website to get the road signs changed to metric. You can write to your MP to ask for further legislation to make the use of medieval units illegal in all retail outlets. You can carry out mathematical activities with your own children or grandchildren using just metric units. And don't forget, if you would like to have a copy of my document, How Big is an Acre? No One Knows, you can order one from the Dr. Metric website. There are other videos and useful documents on the Facebook page and the Dr. Metric website. So thanks very much for listening, And please remember, we're doing this for our children. Let's not bring up a third generation of youngsters who are very confused about measurement, an essential aspect of their mathematical, scientific and technical education.